when we first hear music, there's just a natural response that comes if you see little babies just kind of bopping along. They're not in dance class. It's just
Right.
there. And
Yeah.
it's innately a part of who we are. Your body really truly already knows how to do it. We just kind of get in the way, and the environments that we're creating are just so that your body has that space and the conditions that foster it to do what it already knows how to do.
Have you ever thought about how movement can act like medicine? A way to release and express and connect beyond words? For thousands of years, people have used dance and movement to heal. From the grounding communal rhythms of African dance to the flowing energy of Tai Chi, movement has long been a way to clear energy, balance emotions, and create strong connections within communities. These practices remind us that movement is more than just exercise. It's actually a full language that can reach places within us that words simply can't. Today, we're diving into this idea of movement as medicine with my guest, Jaycee Gossett, a dancer, teacher, and lifelong advocate for the power of movement to heal. Jaycee's journey has taken her from competitive ballroom dance to exploring dance traditions around the world. And now she shares her unique perspective through the class, a movement method that combines breath, sound, and repetitive movement to help people reconnect with themselves and with each other. In the class, movement isn't just about strength and exercise. It's about releasing emotions, clearing energy, and supporting overall well-being and longevity. In our conversation, Jaycee shares how different dance traditions carry their own healing stories and healing languages, and how the class taps into these ideas to help us release energy, build resilience, and experience lasting wellness and longevity. We also talk about how something as simple as setting an intention can make movement more meaningful and more healing, and how practicing in a group adds a whole new layer of connection. So, whether you're curious about bringing more intention into your movement, looking to tap into the healing power of dance, or just interested in a new approach to wellness, Jaycee's insights will open up a whole new perspective on movement. So excited to share this conversation with Jaycee Gossett. I'm Dr. Avanti, and this is The Healing Catalyst. Hello, Jaycee. It is so nice to meet you.
So happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me and the practice of the class onto your podcast to talk about movement and healing and feeling, all my favorite things to discuss.
Yes, I am so excited to jump into all the things with you. I was so intrigued by your background. You have done so many things, all styles of dance, so many different cultures and their dance styles that you've, really studied. And so you bring such a wide breadth of sort of experience and knowledge to the idea of movement and healing and traditional ways of healing through dance and movement. And so I'm just so excited to jump into all of this. And so I kind of wanted to start with, you have done like all different styles of dance, everything from competitive ballroom dancing to, then now with the class teaching a very spiritually infused sort of movement practice. And so I just wanted to start with, how have all of these different forms of movement and dance influenced your approach to healing through movement?
Mm. So I really feel like movement is my love language and also just my language, period. Like I have a lot of friends and people in my family that picked up musical instruments very quickly, or when I was in Spanish class as a kid, everybody else was picking it up very quickly, and for me, I was always very clunky. And then when it came to movement, it was like, oh, this is a language I understand. Like my body just it resonates with it, and it also can pick it up very quickly, but I feel way more connected and in a deep communication when I'm moving with somebody or moving versus actually speaking and talking. Talking
Hmm.
and speaking was always like came later for me. I had to like learn how to take my feelings and form words. So
Mhm.
to communicate what I was sensing and feeling, but movement was just like an instantaneous transmission of that and communication and technology. So when I started moving as a kid, I didn't know really what was happening, but I was just like feeling this. I always felt great. I always felt so much better, but there was something else happening that, now looking back, was a connection to something bigger, was me feeling maybe more like myself, was me moving through stress and tension as a kid from what was going on in my house. And then when that love of movement drove me to really understand how people move their bodies all over the world and get the stories behind the movements, because I was always interested, like, well, why do we move our hips like that in this dance, and how come it's just about the hands in this dance? And when I started to understand the stories and the history behind the movements, that all of the movement is a communication. There's like a story happening just with the body, and each part of the body can represent a different energy or different emotion. If you're dancing with your hands versus your hips or your shoulders. And that informed so much about the different cultures that I was studying, just by looking at, like, wow, these are the parts of the body that we're moving. And then this is the story behind the why this dance exists. And every dance that I studied became like a personality, like falling in love with a different person. And it was impossible to choose. People would always ask me, like, what's your favorite dance, and what's your, and I was like, wow, how can you choose? It's like children's, like, which one's your favorite? They're all so unique and marvelous and have this personality and energy. And when you're engaging with it, you're in that energy. You're like ingesting it, and it's
Yeah.
working on you in the way of the intent behind it. So it took
Mhm.
me a while from my origins. At first, even though I felt something happening in dance and movement that was so magical, it wasn't presented to me in my environment or my culture as something healing or ritualistic or about ceremony. It was either like competition, performance,
Mhm.
um, show,
Mhm.
or exercise and burning calories. And
Right.
then through the various studying, I was like, wow, there are techniques that are about the energy and the feeling and the narratives and what your body is holding, which was about the internal world, the somatic part of it, versus the external and the show.
Wow, so many questions for you that I have some curiosities about some of the things that you said. And one thing that I'm thinking about is that I love your description of movement and dance as a language, as your love language. Because I do think, just from the study that I've done of how movement and energy in the body works, is that we do communicate through our movement. I mean, that's why there's this whole area of study of body language, right? So much can be told by body language, or even when we're sitting with someone, we can intuit so much by their movements, their body language. It is a language, quite literally, which is what I think you're sort of talking about. And so what's so interesting is that I feel like as kids, and you sort of alluded to this, that you started sort of feeling this language that you could tap into as a child versus speaking and communicating that way was through like the body language and movement. I feel like children do that a lot more than adults. It's sort of like we don't grow out of it. We're sort of forced out of it,
Yeah.
of using our body language to communicate what we're really feeling. And it's more about what's the body language that you are transmitting in a meeting or in a social gathering, right? It is much more performative. Let's talk about that. Like, what are your perspectives of that?
Yes, I did some studying with Shiva Ray, and she has this program called Yoga Trance Dance. It's like like a method that she offers, and in a lot of part of that training, she and Gabrielle Roth, who created Five Rhythms, they talk a lot about movement from as babies, and that no one teaches you. I mean, if you were born with the ability to move, there is no teaching you movement. Like, babies are just moving,
Hmm.
and
Right.
whatever it is that they're feeling, is there's no filter. They're just like having the emotion, and you see it coming out of their body if they ever having a tantrum or if they're happy. And we learn that when we first hear music, there's there's just a natural response that comes if you see little babies just kind of bopping along. They're not in dance class. It's just
Right.
there. And
Yeah.
it's innately a part of who we are. And in my experience, it wasn't a part of my culture. So movement was like acceptable for kids in sports and like, okay, now it's gym class and you're doing like this, but it wasn't a part of the daily life and the human experience. It was sort of separate. And then the rest of the time was about sitting still and behaving
Yes.
and kind of being like an adult and taking all of that energy that you just innately have as a child and like suppressing it and holding it in because to your point performing that was what behaving was and what
Right.
behaving looked like. And of
Sure.
course, I mean, all of this other stuff then starts to happen because there's this energy kind of trying to move but it has nowhere to go. And when I started just kind of studying movement and looking around the world and found it really fascinating that in other cultures, like you continue moving. Movement and dancing is a part of your daily life. Like when you're in your house, maybe you're dancing with your cousins or your aunties and your uncles. And
Right.
I was so far from my experience. I mean, I saw my parents probably dance once or twice at a wedding in my entire
Mhm.
life.
Right.
And the rest was, I mean, and no, not saying anything bad about them because that's the culture that they came from as well. But we just weren't expressing ourselves that way. So in the other environments where I was like, wow, it just continues. You know, you learn to dance from your relatives. You're not going to dance school, you're learning from your relatives. And then every time you get together, it's just part of everything. Maybe it's at the wedding, but it's also at the funeral. Maybe it's on a special day. Maybe there's no reason behind it but that energy is continues to move and then it becomes normalized and there's no shame where in my environment like once you hit a certain age then the movement was shameful. It was like, oh, don't draw attention to yourself, you don't want anybody to look at you, especially as in a female identifying body. There was a lot of shame around that, how it was bad and it was sensual and it was like drawing the wrong attention and not acceptable.
Yeah. So, one thing that kept coming up for me as you're saying this is that, when you go to the bush, to safari, right? And you see animals in their natural habitat, right? I remember reading that, their natural state of, dealing with trauma. So if they've, been preyed upon by a predator and they're very, very scared, after the predator leaves, if they survive that, they'll shake, right? It's almost like this movement to release the anxiety and the fear, right?
Mhm.
We as humans are taught to sort of keep it in. We're not
Mm.
supposed to respond if we're fearful, like don't cry, don't shake, don't,
Yes.
and these are normal responses. I was an ER doctor and this is a normal response of dealing with the trauma that you've just experienced in an injury or in an accident, right? But we are so socialized to not do that. And so, this image keeps coming up for me as you're talking about, as children, our natural sort of state of being is to move, to sort of express our feelings, whether it's fear or happiness or sadness, right? Children are very expressive with their movements. I mean, and their voice also at many times, but many times it's their movements that tell us how they're feeling. But we don't do that as adults, right?
Mm. It's the opposite. Feel less, emote less, and and
Right.
everything you're saying, totally yes, and double click. And the body has these innate things that it already does, which is always so wild because we're trying to
Right.
override a system that's so ancient and
Mhm.
proven and so deeply wired that we spend all this time in our like the more modernized we get to try and override it, but it has that technology already and like tears. It's processing energy and emotion. There's salt in there. There's a detoxification, laughing, making sound. We do a lot of vocal release in the class, so you may just you don't even know you're doing it sometimes, but your system, the body is trying to always harmonize and move towards some state of either healing or resetting, just like the animal shaking. And that may come with laughing, it may come with tears, it may come with big sounds and sighs, yawning, stretching.
Sure. Mhm.
shaking, just needing to jump up and down. And then we spend all of this time overriding that and trying to fit it in a box where it's just a little bit more acceptable and not making anybody feel uncomfortable. And Peter Levine studied a lot around the way that animals process stress and emotion and cortisol and the stress hormones. And he went deep into that, and part of that conversation was like, they're constantly in flight or fight, they're prey or predator, but how come they don't have these long-term trauma responses? And part of that theory
Right.
was how they are constantly regulating and regulating and regulating, which, no one is teaching us to do that.
Exactly, exactly, and you're so, like, right along my wavelength, like, we're thinking in the same way, is that, what I'm thinking about is that if children were encouraged to keep, expressing through movement, they would be able to move this trauma out, and so we wouldn't have all of these young adults and even, young children in their adolescence, but, young adults, teenagers, and then adults sort of walking around with all this trauma trapped in their bodies because they haven't released it. And so, it's exactly that. If we could be more in our natural state, just like animals are, and release that energy through movement, my gosh, how much better off would we be from an emotional, psychological, spiritual, and even physical perspective, because it's all connected, of course, right? And
Totally
so
off.
it's really interesting. And so, you were talking about some of these different cultures. Tell us about, I read that you studied in Brazil and some other places. Tell us about some of those experiences. Like, so where did you sort of start, where you started exploring other cultures and their dance styles, and what did you kind of learn? Take us through some of those. It's
Mhm.
really interesting.
Yeah, I even as a kid, I was fascinated with like the globe and maps and television shows or documentaries that explored the different parts of the globe. Like I just was always so interested in that. And after my own journey through movement of taking dance as a kid, and then that leading to yoga, and then yoga leading to spirituality, and then spirituality leading to this other conversation of like, what else is there in movement? Because they were still very separate from me, of like movement and spirituality, or like movement, dance, and then healing. It was all very still separate. And then when I found competitive Latin ballroom dancing, I got to learn the cha-cha and the rumba and the paso doble and salsa and swing, and those dances pushed me to want to know how the samba was created and what was happening behind it. And I wanted just to go to the source. I was very lucky at a period in my life that I wanted to travel and volunteer, and I kind of started my journey in Vietnam and found a place where I could volunteer my time with helping like a youth center there. And then that turned into almost like an exchange where I was starting to learn culture and dance. And then as an offering, I was just teaching whatever it is that I could teach, like this exchange. And that trip to Vietnam turned into like an entire year in Southeast Asia and
Mm.
studying all different forms of movement. And while I was doing that and taking my own videos and having this without speaking the language at all, um,
Wow.
it was like, wow, right? We could travel through the lens of food. We could travel through the lens of art. You could travel through the lens of so many different things. But what about movement and dance? And
Mhm.
the more I learned the stories of the movements, and then also had these incredible experiences with other humans without speaking the same language, it it brought this unbelievable, like, just human approach, this humanity of like all the same in some way. And that just led to another place and another place and another place, and eventually I took all of this kind of concept, and I, at this point in my life, connected with a producer that was interested in maybe making it into a television show or a documentary, a series. And I worked with the Travel Channel, and we went to Brazil, and I participated in learning the roots of the samba to prepare for Carnival, which was unbelievable and
Mhm.
amazing.
Wow.
But so many stories, from being in Cuba to being in Africa to going to Texas and learning line dancing. Everywhere I went, I just was like, okay, what's the dance and what's the story?
Mhm. Right.
And in
And so what are
there,
some of the stories? Tell us about some of
yes.
sorry.
So when I was in Cuba, there's a dance called the merengue. Have you ever heard of the merengue?
Mhm. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so it's one of when I say simple, it doesn't have a complex choreography. It's just kind of like 1, 2, 1, 2, step, step. And there was narratives of like, oh, did it come from Cuba? Did it come from the DR? And lots of different places trying to claim it. But when I was in Cuba, the information that was shared with me was this kind of, as slaves were coming from Africa, and it's so terribly devastating and heartbreaking to be thinking in this way. But as slaves were coming from Africa, also when any kind of human was trying to oppress another civilization or culture, part of that technique was robbing of the music and the dance, robbing the expression. So like you're not allowed to do your dance
Right.
anymore, there's no more singing, there's like no more expression, which helped me understand how powerful it was. Well, it's like, well, if that's being taken away, then that means there's a lot of power in it, because if that is some gateway to freedom or spirit or something, like still having hope or sense of self, then of course that wants to be stripped away. So in Cuba, with the slaves shackled, even though they couldn't move, there was like a shuffle that could happen. And
Right.
as people started migrating around the globe for all different reasons, it then would merge with whatever the culture was there and whatever the dance was there. So then you would start to see that shuffling being blended with whatever was happening in like the upper echelon society, and
Mhm.
forming a new movement and a new dance.
Right. That's so interesting. Yeah. I mean, isn't it interesting that, movement can be a form of communication? And if someone wants to oppress you and cut off communication, they'll try and also cut off your movement, right?
Yeah.
And it kind of even goes back to what we were talking about, children sitting in a room in a school and they have to sit still. They're not allowed to move, right? For whatever reason. And now I know that things are a little bit different now in schools. That is changing a little bit compared to when, I was in school. I'm older than you, I'm sure, when we had to really sit still. So I think that that has changed because I think more and more people are understanding how helpful that is to human beings to sort of express their emotions and move. And it does help them actually learn better in different ways, right? But it's so interesting how we can try and suppress another form of communication and expression and healing and moving energy to cut people off from sort of their healing process or their birthright, right?
Their power, their source.
Yes.
It's about control. It is about control. And if you
Mhm.
can rob someone of all of the things that make them feel free, right? You start to break the spirit. You're trying to break the spirit, which again, that understanding for me was like, wow, that is so, because it's so powerful, because it's, I mean, when you think about it, how much has been underestimated, like, oh, whatever, dance and movement and music, like singing, and it becomes this like extracurricular activity, when really it's like, wow, it's so powerful. It's so powerful. It causes fear for people that there's going to be an uprising or something because there's music and there's dance and the body is moving. I mean, even just the movie Footloose, bringing it a little closer to home. Elvis, I mean,
Yeah, yeah. Oh my gosh, totally, right. And what's so interesting is that, there is so much power because I do think that it connects you as a human being to a larger power source, right? Through dance. I don't know. That's what I've always sort of intuited. And I feel like that's sort of some of what your work is in this method of the class. But Most people associate spiritual practices to be with more stillness and quiet, right? Breath work, meditation, things that I talk about on this podcast all the time. And even yoga to a certain extent is quieter, more meditative movement, right?
Right.
Walking can be more meditative movement. But what you're talking about is dance and expression through dance, and that sort of being sort of a gateway to spirituality or to intention or to connecting with a higher source, right? And that's sort of what the class is about. Tell me about sort of what your perspective is on that.
So when it comes to spirituality and the term spirituality, there's lots of different ways people can explain that, and the one that always resonated with me is very simple. It's just the process of looking in. That's it. Just the process of looking in. If you're looking out, it's one thing, but if you're starting to take the gaze and the awareness into the internal world to be with yourself, to be with your heart, your feeling, your energy, your thoughts, your memories, your experiences, and go inward as a way to connect to yourself and then connect potentially to something bigger if that is what works for you and you're aligned with, then really ultimately you can be doing that while you're doing anything safely, closing your eyes, obviously don't drive and close your eyes. But in theory, everything could become a meditation if the awareness is going in and then you're breathing. So we do a lot of deep breathing at the class. There's a lot of cueing of the breath, a lot of vocal release, long, slow inhales, as well as big exhales. And we are meditating on the breath, going inward in that internal reflection, but the body is in movement. And for some people,
Hmm.
doing all of that sitting or lying down works for them. For some people, that's a complement to the class, or the
Right.
class is a complement to that. And for some people, for
Mhm.
whatever reason, it just doesn't resonate for them. So the movement, just like runners kind of get into that meditative trance like state, or surfers, or sometimes you'll even hear people riding a motorcycle. And when I was studying at this meditation center in India, my part of my job while I was there was that I got to, I didn't have to, I got to clean the teacup of the now I'm blanking, when you're in a monastery, the person is the nun and the monk,
The monk,
right? Yes.
the monks. Mhm.
The monks, to clean the teacup. And the way that it was explained to me was like, you could just get in there and just like wash the teacup and then fill it up and bring it to the monk. The whole intent was that it was a spiritual practice. So how am I washing the teacup
Right.
in a way with my breath, mindfully infusing it with a certain kind of energy, because I'm like bringing it to the person who's going to deliver the lecture and take us through the meditation, and
Right.
how to then take that and then infuse that into every part of your life, so that meditating or spirituality doesn't have to be so separate and fragmented into, well, we do it over here, but we don't do it over here. We can do it sitting down, but we can't do it when we're talking to our spouse.
Yeah. I love how you described it as spirituality as going inward, when the gaze goes inward. The way that I often talk about meditation, it can be anything that allows you to have a point of focus. And the point of focus that you're talking about is inward, right? And so whether you're gazing at a flame or washing dishes or the cup, as you said, or running or swimming or sitting on a mat, on a cushion in a position, whatever, walking, whatever it is that you're doing, if you can have a point of focus that then helps you turn inward, I think that's what we're getting at, is that becomes a meditation, that becomes the intention, right? And then you add the breath. So let's go into sort of, first of all, what is the class? We've been dancing around it. Haha, no pun intended. We've kind of been going around what the class is. Explain to my listeners, because many of them may not know what it is. What
Mhm.
is the class, first of all?
Okay, so the class is a method, it's a movement method, and it is a music driven practice where we are exercising the body, moving the body to engage the mind. And by moving the body with breath and sound and awareness, we can then connect to the heart and feel this deeper connection to ourselves, our life, and community. So we move the body to settle the mind and open the heart. And how that looks, because people always say, like, well, what are you doing? But what are you actually really doing with your body? We're doing a series of repetitive cardio and strength based exercises. They're movements you've probably seen before without a lot of choreography or complexity: squats, jumping jacks, planks, um, donkey kicks, abdominal exercises, burpees. And we put them on repeat, and then once we start moving in that repetition, we go into the breath. And then the breath helps us start to discover the internal world. What are the thoughts that are coming up? It moves into a meditation. What are the feelings? What is the energy? What is the texture of the sensations and maybe memories that you can start to meet by bringing your awareness that way? And then once that content starts to show itself, we'll use breath and sound to let things really process and move through. And through that, things start to release through the body. You'll notice that the mind gets a little bit clearer. You'll feel more energized, grounded, present. Um, and having this incredible experience with yourself where you're getting to know yourself. I mean, we spend all of this time getting to know other people and learning about other things, but we don't really study ourselves. It's like the untapped resource. We'll read a billion books about something else, but this is the process of really learning, self-study. How you're wired, what comes up, what are you thinking about, what are you feeling, where do you feel it, how do your hips feel, how do your shoulders feel, what's in there?
Yeah. How did you come up with this method of this idea? I mean, where did it come from?
Okay, so Taryn Toomey is our founder, and Taryn and I were studying with some of the same teachers. We were studying with a yoga teacher, Allison Sinatra. She was also at that time doing a lot of women's work, women's circles. This was like probably when we were in our 20s, a long time ago. And Taryn was also a yoga teacher. I did my yoga teacher training. She was also teaching fitness. She was also working in the fashion world as an executive, but had this deep pull towards spirituality and movement. But at the time, too, it was like very, very separate. And one of our teachers, Mama Kia, who became a mentor for her, that we met in Peru, that taught her and myself a lot about ceremony and ritual and processing, grieving, ended up passing away. And when she passed away, Taryn's experience of processing that grief, as well as basically her entire life, started to literally just organically come out of her body with movement. And although she had her yoga background and her fitness background, it just started to take this different shape for her. And she introduced it to the people that she was teaching, like one person at a time. Then that person brought another person, and that person brought another person. And she was doing this in the gym of her house, of her building. And then there was too many people to fit in that gym, so she rented the dance studio where her kids were taking ballet lessons. And I took my first class in 2013 in that dance studio where there were like Barbies everywhere. And there was like 38 women in the room. And the energy was just like, wow, what is happening here? What is going on? And once the music started and we started to move, because it's very driven by the beat and the moving on the beat, in that first few seconds, I had no idea about anything. If you could fast forward 10 years from then to now, I never would have ever in a million years have thought that we would be here 11 years later. I would be here 11 years later. But I knew in that moment, I was like, something is happening here that is a yes for me. It's clearly a yes for everybody else here. And this is going to change the way we exercise. It doesn't have to be like, okay, now you go to the gym and then you go to yoga and then you meditate and then you have your therapy. And who has 10 hours a day to do all those things?
Right, right. Wow. And so did it bring up sort of some of what you had seen? I mean, it sounds like it kind of clicked for you of all the experiences you had had from childhood in all these forms of dance all over the world, and then you experienced it in this sort of Western
Right.
way,
In an
right?
accessible way, in an accessible Western way, because I mean, we can explain the class in so many different ways, and the accessible way is movement and fitness, because I think still things can be maybe feel like a little woo woo or a little out there, and but most people know that exercise is good for them. They know that like fitness and moving their body is something our doctors tell us we should do, and that it's good for us. So if you could take that thing that's very digestible, very accessible, but then also layer in these other things of the meditation and the mindfulness and the breath work and the vocal release and the spirituality, but in a container and a vehicle that feels very safe, very accessible, very digestible for people, then something really amazing can happen, because it's being presented in this like, oh, that's familiar. There's some squats and some jumping jacks and doing some planks.
Right. Yeah. And so, what this is bringing up for me is really what true yoga is, right? And so, I'm a yoga therapist by training, and sort of yoga therapy is this idea of let's go back to what yoga really is. It's not about the pose, it's not about the asana. It's about all of the other things that are happening, right? Yoga is to yoke the mind and the breath and the body, right? And the breath informs sort of what's in the way of the mind and the body, right? And so we are supposed to, in yoga, breathe and, synchronize our breath with the movement, and it should be dynamic, et cetera. So what you're talking about is so familiar to me from that perspective. And like you said, it's also presenting it in a way that maybe is a little bit easier for people to meet people where they are in some ways, right? If they're not ready for yoga, even though yoga has become so incredibly popular in the West, there is, a lot of discussion a lot of times around, is it woo woo? Is it a religion? Is it all these things? And you're sort of, what you're talking about with the class is sort of a Western sort of approach to meet people where they are. So I really
Mm-hmm,
appreciate that.
mm-hmm,
Um, in Ayurveda, the basis of Ayurveda is that, the energy body is the blueprint for the human body, right? Ayurveda is older than traditional Chinese medicine. We knew about the energy body and all the energy, all the chakras as the energy centers, and the nadis and the marmas, all of that, right? And that the idea is that when we have blocked energy, that is when illness will start to develop, right? It can be very subtle. And as that blockage continues, it can become more and more serious, where it shows up as, more chronic symptoms, illness, disease, right? And so what you're talking about to me is ways to unblock that energy, is
mm-hmm,
what I'm hearing.
mm-hmm.
Is that sort of what you were saying? Because you're talking about that, when you went to the first class, you felt this energy. It's almost like that was releasing, right? Let's talk
Totally.
about that.
Totally. So we know that if we're going to talk about the block centers, and then we know when energy is in flow, if we're going to use the word prana and life force or vitality, um, we know that things that can enhance flow and life force are things like movement, music, breathing, sending the breath and bringing your awareness to the energy centers, the chakra centers, being outside, being with community, yoga, meditation, all these things. So in the class, we're taking all of that together, and via the breath and the movement and that visual of going into the energetic centers where you're bringing your awareness and cultivating that breath, you can start to feel in the somatic processing of it
Mhm.
where the tension is.
Right,
So
right,
potentially when we're not tuned in and checked in, we might know we're not where the tension is. You don't know until all of a sudden you're like, wow, my back is out. But
right,
probably there was like these little tiny alarm signals going off of something maybe not processing through, emotions getting stuck. And then all of a sudden
right.
it's like, wow, my back's out. But if we can start to do this as a daily upkeep, but also preventative health, starting to understand maybe where that tension is living, and you'll feel it physically, but also your breath will just start to show you, where is it shallow, where is it tight, where is there not flow, where is things not moving. And if you can bring that awareness to where it feels congested or tight or even just cut off, there'll be lots of moments of my day where I'll feel like, wow, I'm really just like blocked in my throat, or I don't feel myself at all from here down. And once you start to
Mhm.
move, wow, am I in like a no engagement of my abdominals right now? My whole pelvic area, just nothing is happening there. And
Right.
the movement and the breath and bringing that awareness can start to light those centers back up, but then also give the tension a place to release with the sound and the creating that vibration of sound that's going to go through the body with the music.
Yeah. And so, what's so interesting about this is that I actually wrote about this in my book, right? The longevity formula, because the whole formula is about increasing the flow of prana, right? We really want to, that's one of the longevity switches that I talk about in the book. And so many of the practices that are adding prana, but also moving prana through the human system, right? And this is a way to do that. And, I talk specifically about yoga and like the 10 poses that you should do to add 10 more years to your life. You don't have to do those 10 poses. Those are just what we've, written about and I've studied. Any kind of movement, what you're talking about, will help to move the energy through the body and that keep that prana flowing, which increases longevity through all of this different mechanisms that we talk about in the book. But what you're talking about is so, in line with this idea of longevity, right? And it's a very simple thing we can do. Like, I mean, I would love for everyone to go to the class, and I know that we're going to have a link in the show notes because you guys have so generously given all of the listeners, a trial period of the class, which is amazing. Thank you for doing that. But I feel like they don't even have to go to, I mean, it's wonderful to do that in a community and do it online,
Yeah.
but just moving in this way, right?
Just moving.
You could just shake.
Put on your favorite song. 2 minutes. It doesn't have to be long. 1 minute song. It could be in your car, it could be in your room, and just let your body move and breathe.
Mhm. Yeah. What is I mean, I always love to give the listeners something tangible that they can sort of do like now, starting today. What would be a simple practice that you would suggest that kind of is, you know, sort of an ode to sort of the methods in the class, but something that they could experience on their own at home trying to do? What could they do maybe?
Great. So that first suggestion of play your favorite song. So it doesn't matter what style of music is, what genre, and you can change it up, but put something on that inspires you to move without any need of choreography or looking a certain way. Maybe you close your eyes, maybe you don't. You don't have to look in the mirror, and just let the movement meet your body and your body meet the movement. And if you can do it for 30 seconds, amazing. If you could do it for 60 seconds, incredible. If it's a minute, 2 minutes, doesn't have to be very, very long. If you want to add on to that, using any type of sound while you're moving to just express how you're feeling. And maybe that's a woohoo, or maybe that's a ah, or maybe that's a
Mhm.
bigger roar, or a big
Right.
sigh. And so much of that practice and work is removing the judgment about how we look or how we might sound, or geez, if anyone saw us doing this, and give yourself permission to just feel and breathe and move however you want. That would be one. I also love making vocal release and sound in my car. In my car, I feel like I'm in my little bubble, and I live in Los Angeles, so there's a
Yeah,
lot of carring,
sure.
car culture. But when you're in there, you can kind of do whatever safely. But I'll just sometimes with music, sometimes not. I'll just vocalize how I'm feeling. And I'll just like how a baby babbles, blah 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 blah. Or maybe it's there's a wonderful woman, Vanika, who did a lot of vocal training and vocal therapy with us at the class, and just the e ah oh mama 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 mama, and just let it go. Keep going, keep going, keep going, and notice how you feel afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would even add on to that that, if you are feeling self-conscious about making those songs, just sing the song. Like, put on your favorite song that has, lyrics that and just sing them as loud as you can, or, with lots of expression, because you are then using your voice quite literally. And that sometimes can be a gateway into making the sounds. I know a lot of people hesitate because even with, when I'm teaching meditation and a mantra meditation, people get very worried about saying mantras that maybe they don't understand, or sounds like the beach sounds that don't have any meaning. People get a little stressed out by that because,
Yeah.
again, it's something that we are told not to do, right, from a young child, as children. And so by the time we're adults, we're afraid to make these sounds that were so natural when we were children, right? So singing sometimes can be a great gateway into then going into making those noises or those
And
sounds.
you're breathing,
Yeah.
you're creating a vibration in your body,
Yes.
you're dramatically changing your mood. We feel happier when we're singing.
Mhm. Yeah,
Also,
absolutely.
bringing your awareness to your breath at any point in anything that you're doing, and a way to keep yourself with the awareness that I find helpful is counting. So sometimes just being aware of your breath, inhale and exhale, may not have enough of a hook. So whatever it is that I'm doing, if I feel myself just starting to get a little anxious, or tuned out and checked out to what I'm doing, whatever it is, I'll just start counting. So I could be sitting here with you and be counting inhale for 8 and exhale while I'm driving, while I'm walking. And it doesn't have to be 8. You can do 4, you can do 6, but attaching the number may help you stay with the breath a little bit longer. And then it just becomes a little bit of a game.
Yeah, absolutely. Playing little games with yourself is always a great way to sort of get out of your head and sort of focused on the game of it, and then it kind of starts to come after that. I mean, I think that's really good. I also really liked your idea, or sort of your commentary about, in the class, of sort of tuning into the different chakras and the energy centers, and sort of moving the breath to that energy center. Because, again, it's prana, right? You're moving that prana from, the nature into your breath, into your system, and then you're directing it somewhere. So it's why, if we have discomfort somewhere in our body, just even if there's not a major energy center there, you can say to yourself, oh, there is an energy center there, because there are thousands of chakras in the body besides the 7 main that we all sort of know about. And you can imagine that you are directing your breath to that spot, and you quite literally are directing prana there and helping to move the prana through there and release a blockage. And so I think that that's really important for people to know, that there's not like some magic formula to this, is that
Yes,
any of us can do this with just some
that's right.
intention, right?
That's right. That's right.
Right.
It's your body really truly already knows how to do it. We just kind of get in the way, and the environments that we're creating are just so that your body has that space and the conditions that foster it to do what it already knows how to do.
And so, this idea of intention setting, I know that that's part of the class. Tell us about that, because, there's that saying that where your attention goes is where energy flows, right? So it's sort of the same thing. How do you add intention setting,
So we sometimes at the top of class, we can give people an opportunity to put their hands on their body, feel where they are, hands on their heart, hands on their belly, and then create an intention for the practice. And sometimes that can just be like, go through the motions, and everyone's like, yes, create an intention, and just loses its potency. We'll bring it up later multiple times throughout the class of, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? Because anything can become mundane. Anything can become, what I love so much about ritual and intention, to me, mean really kind of the same thing as like the intent of the why. And then the ritual is just taking something and putting meaning around it. And then you're taking the ordinary and you're making it extraordinary. You're taking the mindless and you're making it mindful. But if we know that where your thoughts are going, your energy is going, and whatever conversation you're having in your head, you're feeding it, we may find that we don't want to feed that, or actually we don't want to grow those thoughts, or we don't want to strengthen that story. So the intention is just like a almost like a little check-in, a wake-up call to come back to be like, wow, what am I thinking about right now? What am I doing right now? Am I doing anything? Was I even in the building? Was I even
Mhm.
in my body? And
Right.
it all is just to
Right.
help you come back. That's it. It's we know we're going to leave, we're going to get distracted, we're going to wander, but really all of it, the intention and the ritual is just an environment for you to be able to come back, check back in. Okay, the one last thing I was going to say about that with the how and the why is sometimes when we give ourselves a how and why of how we want to direct it, we're more likely to be interested and stay focused. And then it becomes about something
Mhm.
bigger about what you're doing in your life. We're not moving the leg to just change the shape of the leg. We're actually doing it to affect how we are showing up and all of the things that you would apply to life. So then it just has like a deeper purpose, and that might be the hook for somebody that very easily may just be like, I don't need to do it, but the how and the why can shift it into a different place.
Yes, absolutely. I'm a big believer in the how and the why. We talk about that a lot on this podcast, is that I think when people understand the why, the how, and the what becomes easier, right? Because there's that intention, there's that understanding of how is this going to actually affect me, and then we can go into the what. Otherwise, it's very easy to be really excited about the what and the how for a couple of days, and then it falls off because you don't understand the why, right? And so I think that that's so much a part of really committing to something that we know is going to really help with our health and our healing and our well-being and our longevity in the long run. The last thing I really wanted to talk about was, this idea of sort of the community around dance, or a method like the class. How does that, because again, when you were describing your first class that you went to, you were like, there's something happening here with all those people in the room. Tell us a little bit about your experience of dance and community.
So movement, whether that is dance or moving in this way with intention, is it's addressing. I mean, there's a loneliness, isolation epidemic that we all read about and hear about, and how that's affecting mental health all over the world. So being in community is essential for the loneliness and isolation that maybe we're feeling from the pandemic. Maybe we're just feeling in general from being so separate and not together. And then when we're coming together and we're joining in a group experience, we're all now starting to move potentially on the beat together, but we're directing our energy not just from ourselves as an individual, yes, but then collectively. So it's almost like, I like to explain it like you're supersizing it. You're taking a magnifying glass of whatever you may be emanating out and tuning into, and whatever vibration you're creating, and then in that group setting it just gets supercharged, supersized, and magnified. So that overwhelming sense of energy around you, of everybody lifting it together and everybody bringing this mindfulness intention of what they're there to do for themselves and their lives, starts here with you, and then offering it up in a bigger way is truly transcendent.
Yeah, I love that description. I once had a friend of mine on this podcast. She's actually a DJ and one of the original DJs of house music. Her name's Laura Branch, and she's been a, a mentor of mine for the past 20 something years. And we were talking about dance and movement and house music specifically, and the beats and the rhythms that are very intentional in house music. And she described everyone getting on the dance floor as it's almost like everyone becomes this living organism,
That's right.
moving together, breathing together. And
Yes.
I've always kept that in sort of that image. And so what you're describing is bringing back that image that Lori once told me about on this podcast, about, sort of being in this community and dancing together to this beat and moving in this way, that you become this joined organism, almost breathing and living. It's like a heartbeat or a breath, which is so beautiful to think about, and how that can be so healing for people. So it's really, yeah, yeah. So, I mean, we could keep talking. I'm so fascinated by all of your experiences. It's so incredible. We'll probably have to do another episode, but I know that we're coming to, sort of the end of our time together. And so, I just have one last question for you. My new book that's coming out in December is called The Longevity Formula. In your experience, what do you see as the essential formula for longevity where our health span equals our lifespan?
Mm. I mean, keep it moving. Keep it moving in whatever way you can. It doesn't have to be full intensity cardiovascular, high impact walking, rolling your wrists out, rolling your shoulders out. I mean, sitting in a chair, making circles with your spine, just your keep the body moving in any way that you can.
Yes. JC, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and for sharing your stories and your experiences. It's really been fascinating. And I know that so many of our listeners are really going to find it so helpful. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. And you can visit us at theclass.com. And we have two studios. We have one in New York City in Tribeca and one in Santa Monica in Los Angeles. So if you're in either of those places, you can come practice with us. And then our digital platform streams in over 70 countries. We have live stream classes as well as on demand videos. And then we host a series of retreats around the world where you can travel with us and move with a group of amazing people.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank
Really,
you.
really enjoyed having you on the podcast.